Hi, I'm Nick. If you clicked on this, it's probably because you want to know a little bit more about the EU referendum. Well, stick with us for the next 10 minutes and we'll take you through 4 of the big talking points. We'll look at how much the EU costs us, how much power it has and its impact on our safety. But first up, immigration.
Let's talk numbers. In 2015, it's estimated 270,000 people came to live in the UK from inside the EU, and 277,000 people came from outside. Take away the number that left the UK in that time, and you get an increase in the population of 188,000 from outside the European Union and 184,000 from inside. This number the UK can control with a points-based system limiting entry. This number though, it can't because of an EU rule called the freedom of movement. So let's explain that. As part of the EU, the UK is in something called the single market. It was set up to help trade between member countries. If you're part of the single market, you have to agree to freedom of movement, meaning EU citizens can come and live and work freely in your country. The Leave campaign would like to extend the points-based system to people coming from Europe as well as those outside. To do that, we'd need to get rid of the freedom of movement and get out of the single market, which would mean leaving the EU. But, and there's always a but, because of the trade benefits, even if the UK was out of the European Union, it may still want to remain in the single market, like Norway. And Norway has a higher proportion of EU immigrants than the UK. So what effect does immigration have on the UK? The Remain camp say migrants are good for the UK economy. Figures show they contribute more to the UK's wallet than they get back, and the majority of them have jobs lined up before they get here. The Leave camp claim immigration can have an impact on jobs. They point to evidence that it can drive down wages, and they say high levels of immigration put too much pressure on public services like hospitals and schools. In simple terms, the immigration debate can be split into 2. On one side, it's all about the benefits. The Remain campaign say it helps the UK's economy and makes the country richer. For the other, it's about control. The Out campaign say the only way to keep numbers in check is to get out of the EU.
One thing we all care about is the amount of cash in our back pocket. And there's been a lot of chat about whether leaving the EU would be good or bad for the size of our wallets. So on the economy, would the UK be better off in or out?
There are some big figures being knocked around by both the In and Out campaigns. The Out campaign is mentioning this one a lot. It's the rough amount they say the UK gives the EU each week in membership fees. Money they say would be better spent on our NHS. But there's a couple of details that we should clear up. First of all, thanks to a deal signed in 1984, the UK never actually pays that amount. It's reduced before going anywhere, so around 276 million leaves our Treasury's pocket. Once that's paid, we get money back for things like farming, and there's also grants given to universities, research centres and engineering institutions. So the actual figure the UK gives to the EU each week is closer to 161 million. Still a lot of cash, but the Remain camp says you should think of it as entry fee into a club, where the free drinks, or in this case taxes, trade and business deals, are worth more than the money you paid to get in. More on that in a sec, but first, the Remain camp are using figures that could do with some explaining too. You might have heard about this one. They claim families would be £4,300 worse off if the UK left the EU. But despite using this line a lot, in truth, it's a guess. A prediction that they don't even think will happen for another 15 years. And even if it did, they've exaggerated their own figures. So now we've dealt with those, let's quickly look at trade. About half the UK's imports and exports are done with other EU countries, allowing businesses to avoid paying taxes when they buy and sell abroad, a bit like duty-free. The Remain camp also claim that 3 million jobs are linked to trade with the EU, though the Leave camp say those jobs won't be under threat because the UK could negotiate better deals on its own. In truth, it's difficult to say what the financial impact of the UK leaving the EU would be. It's all based on guesswork. While economists generally say that EU membership has benefited the UK, it affects different people and businesses in different ways. So while some regions and sectors may gain, Others may lose out.
Decisions made by the EU affect all of us, from the amount of hours we're allowed to work to how much it costs to use our phone on holiday. But just how much control does the EU have?
Leave campaigners say Britain's lost too much power to the European Union, and most laws are made in Brussels, not Britain. The Remain camp, though, say that's not true, claiming it's only a minority of laws. So who's right? Well, to tell the truth, depends on how you calculate it. It's possible to argue anywhere between 15 and 50% of the laws which apply here are made by the EU. And there's disagreement too over how much influence we have over the making of them. It's all to do with these three institutions. The European Commission is where new ideas are brought. See what we did there? Yeesh, I'll turn that down. Each country is represented by a commissioner chosen by the government. When the UK joined, our commissioner was one of 9. Now there are 28. The ideas are then handed to the European Parliament, where politicians vote on the proposals. You do get the chance to elect these people, though to be honest, most of you don't bother. And that might be because the European Parliament isn't as powerful as the European Council. This is where the national governments from each member country have their say. In most cases, the UK agrees with the Council's decisions, but not always. For example, our government has tried to prevent putting a cap on bankers' bonuses and limit the EU's budget. It's lost on both occasions. In fact, in recent years, we've disagreed with the Council's decisions more than any other country. The Remain camp, though, point out that in issues of defence, foreign policy and the raising and spending of taxes, the UK government has sole control. So really, the who controls what argument comes down to this. Is the world still a place where the UK can achieve what it wants without giving up any powers? Or is it better off being in a club with others, even if they get a say in the laws that we live by?
Next up, it's security. Cross-border crime is growing and the risk of a terrorist attack remains high. So is the UK safer in or out of the EU?
How people move around, how we share intelligence, and how we defend ourselves are all up for discussion. Take the recent terror attacks in Paris and Brussels. The majority of people behind the attacks in France were EU citizens. Now, under European rules, almost anyone who lives in an EU country is allowed into the UK. The Leave campaign say that makes it easier for terrorists to come here, and the UK needs stricter entry checks. The Remain camp, though, argue that the UK has more security checks than most. Those in favour of the EU say it's important that Britain stays in so it can share intelligence with other countries. For example, there's Europol, an EU agency set up to fight crime and terrorism, or an agreement that allows EU countries to share DNA samples, fingerprints and mobile phone call data. But the UK's biggest intelligence sharing alliance is with the so-called Five Eyes. That's us, the US, Australia, New Zealand and Canada, and leaving the EU is unlikely to change that. EU countries can and do work together on defence. For example, the British military often train with their French counterparts. But recently there's been talk of an EU army. Neither the in nor the out campaign are particularly keen on the idea, but the Leave camp are worried that it's the way things are heading. Although the EU has denied that, last year a top official, Jean-Claude Juncker, said a European army was needed to stand up to Russia. But it's unlikely, as the UK or any other EU country could block it. So the argument comes down to whether the UK needs to take more ownership of its borders and security, or whether it's better to stay in the EU and have more influence when working with other countries to keep the UK safe.
So that's it. The big vote is on June the 23rd. The big question, should the UK remain part of the European Union or leave? It's up to you.